Hey everybody, and welcome to Slavery Archive, a book club. I am joined today by my co-host, Ana Lucia Araujo, Vanessa Holden, and Jessica Marie Johnson. And together we welcome our distinguished guest, Dr. Rebecca Hall. If this is your first time at book club, the way things go usually is that our guest speaker will present to us their work for 20, 30 minutes. And then after that, we will all come together to participate in a conversation about this wonderful work. Now, there are several ways in which you can participate. We encourage you to type your questions in the chat as Dr. Rebecca Hall speaks, and we'll call you out in order of the questions. You can come on camera if you want to. If you don't feel comfortable, one of us can actually read your questions. This is also being live streamed on YouTube. Those of you on YouTube also feel free to ask questions there. One of us is monitoring YouTube, and we'll be happy to bring your questions back for Dr. Hall here. Now, that said, let me introduce you to our author and speaker today. Rebecca Hall, JD and PhD, is a scholar, activist, and educator. After graduating Berkeley Law in 1989, she represented low-income tenants and homeless families for 8 years before returning to get her PhD in history. She has taught at UC Santa Cruz, Berkeley Law, Berkeley's History Department, and as a visiting professor of law at the University of Utah. She writes and publishes on the history of race, gender, law, and resistance, as well as articles on climate justice and intersectional feminist theory. Dr. Hall's work has been supported by numerous grants and fellowships, including the American Association of University Women, the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. You can find out more about her at rebhallphd.org, and we're gonna put that link in the chat for you, or on Twitter at Wake Revolt. Now, today we're going to be discussing a wonderful graphic novel, Wake, the Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, that was illustrated by Hugo Martínez. And that said, I will pass on the mic to Dr. Rebecca Hall. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for that introduction. I don't normally do big presentations of the work, but so it's not going to be 20 or 30 minutes of me talking, but probably 5 minutes. So it's a weird thing to turn your dissertation into a graphic novel. I mean, that's kind of a weird project. So it, takes some explanation. So the book, Wake, The Hidden History of Women-Led Slave Revolts, is about these slave revolts that women participated in and led in 18th century British America and, during the Middle Passage. And it's also about what it was like, or the process of actually trying to research this in the face of a lot of obstacles, systemic obstacles like racism and sexism, and companies trying to protect themselves from, archival research. And it also talks about the legacy of slavery and living in the wake of slavery. So, I'm sure, this idea of wake work and wake, this is something that a lot of scholars in this area talk about. So that's probably familiar to you all. But, wake has multiple valences, right? Very early in the book, on a page, it took us like 30 hours to design. I'll get into that process in a minute. There's a page, that is literally the wake of a slave ship, if I can find it. For some reason, the publisher forgot to put page numbers. So the next wave is going to have page numbers, and it's coming out in paper. So I'm like, don't forget the page numbers. Yeah, here we go. So in this, if you can see, the wake of a ship has been incorporated into the artwork. And so let's see, what are the questions that people normally ask me? Yeah, how did I decide to do this? So I've always loved graphic novels. I've been really inspired by them. Work like Art Spiegelman's Mouse or Satrapi's Persepolis. And I think that it's a really powerful medium, and I enjoyed them like as a reader. And I thought about, well, what if I could turn my research into a graphic novel? Then I had to learn about what this was, like what is this medium and how does it work? And it turns out that it is very complex and very well thought out. And there was a lot to learn, but I decided to go with it. And I found an artist, Hugo, who's amazing. I had tried 2 artists earlier, and we just put together like a few pages of it and did a Kickstarter. And I thought it was going to be like a self-published or maybe a small press thing. But then it started getting press. And as it was getting more press, like I started to get contacted by people. I got contacted by an editor from HarperCollins, and he says, look, I do young adult. This is completely not appropriate for me, but let me give you some advice, having donated to your Kickstarter, let's give you some advice, and you need to find an agent. And I was like, oh no, because like my understanding of agents are those are those people that you like write to for 3 years and you may or may not find one. And I was like, well, that's going to be quite an obstacle, And then like literally 3 days later, I got a phone call from an agent, like called me and said that she wanted to represent me. And she was the Anjali Singh and with a Harlem literary agency. And she was the one who, discovered and edited Persepolis, and graphic novels are her specialty. So then she taught me how to write a book proposal for mainstream press, and then it was submitted, and then there was an auction, and I didn't even know what an auction was. And there were a lot of publishers, and then they bid on it, and we picked the one that we liked the best. So yeah, that's how that happened. It's kind of like this thing where you sort of back into something and you're just backing in, and then you like turn around and realize, whoa, I'm suddenly here. Like, I don't know how this happened. I still don't quite understand how it's happening, but and I'm working on a second book that Simon & Schuster optioned, a graphic novel that's going to be taking place. Tentatively, it's called Taking Freedom, Black Women and Emancipation. So it's putting me into the 19th century where I don't feel comfortable, but I'm working on it. So, so why a graphic novel? I'm just gonna assume people are gonna ask me that first, and I'll just, explain. So it's a really powerful and unique medium that allows a relationship between like linear text and all at once art to interact in a way that that doesn't exist in other mediums. And so it's like and so you can do things like, particularly in Wake, there's a lot of emphasis on the relationship between the past and the present. And you can literally put those two things up against each other in a way that I actually don't know how one would do that in another medium. And it's funny, there's been a lot of reviews of Wake and people, breaking down the book and the art, and how you like learn things about your own book from other people's writing about it. So there's an image in the book of me walking down the street of New York during my, dissertation research, and I get like, completely bumped into by some white man walking down the street, which happens frequently. But Hugo, my artist, drew that, and then we drew the, I had him draw the reflection of that same man, but, an 18th century man, like in a tricorn hat, and in the setting is New York City, and when it's a slave city. So like that literal bumping up of past and present. And the other thing is, in the graphic medium, there's this concept called the gutter, which is the space between panels, right? It's this little space between panels. And that's almost like the methodology of the medium. It's it's like if you want to see every frame of something, you watch a movie, right? Because that's what it is. It's frame after frame after frame, in front of your eyes. With the graphic medium, you need to choose what you're going to focus on and how you're going to interrelate those things. And like, I've always been fascinated with the idea of like the shape of absence, like what shape does absence have? And the gutter itself can be really useful in telling the fragmentary stories of the lives of enslaved Black women, which, as we know, the archive holds like merely fragments. So it's a method to like recover the story, but you have to be very thoughtful about what you're putting where, So I'd like to create like a Black feminist methodology for using the comics medium for this type of recovery. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's what I'm working on. But so once you understand that there's the gutter, there's actually professors of this medium who talk about blood in the gutter, or like how the absence, presence, how you work with those. You can do things to mess with it in a way that furthers your goal. So like in this page, there's me looking through the court. Is that in focus? I can't tell. Looking through the court documents and trying to find the stories of these 4 women involved in the 1712 revolt. And so here is, the shape of absence, and that, they're there, but and we have their names from the court record. And then we have them, crossing the gutter to where I am. And so there's all of this sort of tension that you can create that makes these stories accessible, but doesn't at all dumb down the material. And using this medium to its fullest effect is really powerful. So yeah, I guess that's all I can think of for now. Is just what questions people might have.
Thank you, Dr. Holt. This is a great way to get us started. I am sure that we can come up with many more questions. Yes, we academics have a knack for coming up with a lot of interesting questions in the Q&A session. So I'm going to give an opportunity for everybody to breathe, absorb, and start formulating their questions. If you already have questions you want to ask, you can just raise your hand. I see a lot of praise in the chat right now. And I think we already have one question coming to us from Cynthia Gayton. Cynthia, would you like to ask your question live?
Sure. It's very interesting, the idea of absence, because that's something I'm working on now with a documentary that I'm working on. I just completed a documentary about cemeteries in Harper's Ferry, and it was specifically dealing with the absence of records. And trying to build a story around absence is actually very fascinating from just to investigate those things. But I like how you're depicting the absence in the visual form. Because it's one thing to say, well, this is where somebody was supposed to have been buried or could have been buried. But it's a similar kind of thing. So building narratives around the lack of information, it's like evidence, you're collecting evidence, and this is circumstantial, and all these pieces of information are evidence of perhaps this thing. But I really like your use of a graphic novel, because it allows people to linger, and look at the image and kind of absorb those absences. So it looks great.
Thank you. Yeah, that's actually another thing about the medium that's really powerful, is that the reader becomes a participant, in that they decide how long to spend looking at an image or images. They sort of, the medium almost interpolates people into it, because, they participate in setting the timing of how the story, how fast the story is going to go, where on the page they're going to look. And I've had people say to me like, oh yeah, I read it in an hour. And it's like, yeah, you can do that, and then later they'll be like, oh, I reread it over and it took like 7 hours and I looked at all the pictures and now I'm crying. It's like, yeah, you can do it that way too,
So my question, actually, I forgot to ask you my question because I was so enthralled.
Yeah.
The question is, how long did it take for you to do this from start to finish?
The graphic novel itself. Yeah. You're not talking about my dissertation research or the stuff it's based on, the graphic novel itself. Yeah. So it took a long time, but it became my and Hugo's full-time job. And it was about 2.5 years. Because one of the things is that it's very rare for there to be graphic novels. I hate the term novel, but it's the term. So to have a separate writer and artist, and there wasn't a lot of role modeling for how to create that relationship. And so we were just winging it, so there would be we actually ended up having to hire a couple of pre-production assistants. So, that's how complicated it was. First thing was visual research. When I was writing this stuff as a dissertation or an article, I wasn't thinking visually about it at all, and that's like, oh, we're going to try to now present this, and then it's like, so that took at least another 6 months of going and just trying to get everything from what clothes people wore down, to, one of the women who was involved in the 1712 revolt, Sarah, one of the few facts we know about her, other than that she participated in the revolt, was, was convicted of doing that and was executed. We actually don't even know that part. If you read the book, you'll see it's complicated. But we know that she was owned by a rope maker, and so we started to do research into how did they make ropes in 1712? What would a rope making factory in 1712 in New York look like? And and I was like, okay, I did a couple hours of that, and I'm like, that's enough. But Hugo wouldn't let it go. He was like a dog with a bone. So it was like after 20 hours of him researching this, and we're not in the same place. He's in New Orleans, I'm in Salt Lake. So finally, I was just like, enough about the ropes. Just stop the ropes and go on to something else. And then, of course, the ropes was literally one tiny panel of the whole book. But you don't really know. So all of that visual research, the sort of back and forth communication was really interesting, because I had to learn for myself that I always thought of myself, I'm not a visual person. I read books. That's my favorite thing to do. I'd rather read a book than watch something on TV. If there's a book that has pictures, I'll read the words and then maybe look at the pictures and maybe not. And I'm like, so this is gonna be really hard for me. And then I came to realize, we're actually all visual people. We live in a visual culture. It's around us constantly. And because Hugo is, he's a comics artist, not a historian, also quite intimidated, by, I guess, a little intimidated by me, which I hope that goes away soon. But anyway, it was I would come up with ideas about how maybe I would want to see it on the page, and he would pencil, sketch it, storyboard it, send it back. I'd be like, that doesn't quite work. And then we'd go back and forth and back and forth. And that is a really exhaustive process. But it was I was writing a script while he was storyboarding and penciling. And then once the script was done and the pencils were done, there was a year of him inking and, getting all kinds of wrist injuries and, inking with because, and that's the other thing too, is I wanted an artist who did things by hand. This sort of digital comics is a really big thing right now. And I personally don't find it, I find it hard to resonate emotionally with it. So I really, picked him because of his style of doing things with, pen and ink. Yeah. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. We have a couple of questions, so we're already coming in on the chat. I wanted to ask Lois if, Lois, do you want to ask the question live, or you would prefer one of us to ask the question?
Either way is fine with me.
You don't have to come on video. If you want to read your own question out loud, you can do that.
Sure. And it sort of builds on the answer you just gave. So it sounds like this project started as very straight academic research, which most of us are familiar with. And then you had to immerse yourself in translating it with your very talented collaborator into this medium. You said that now you're beginning a second project, which you're researching, knowing that it's going to end up as a graphic narrative. And I prefer graphic narrative to novel, especially when it's nonfiction, as your work is.
Thank you.
But how is it shaping your research process to know that your end is going to be this graphic narrative, as opposed to when you did the first project, where you were just doing the dissertation research, as so many of us have done?
Well, I think one thing right away, and it helps that it's 19th century, there's actually some photos, I mean, really early photographs, but, and drawings and, so like immediately as I'm researching stuff, looking at, okay, where's the visual? So it's not like a kind of a later thing. So I think this whole thing is going to go much more smoothly and hopefully won't take as much time. Although the art takes the time that it takes. So yeah. And I think one thing I wanted to say too, which your question reminds me, which I feel like I didn't really quite address in the how did I come to do this, is that I have a very long and windy and weird, unfortunate academic history, where, I got my PhD in history, then I did a 2-year postdoc at Berkeley when, there were no jobs in history and people were like, why don't you go for law? You've got that JD from Berkeley. Why don't you teach law? And I, started going on the market for law. And anyway, long story short, there was just a lot of racism and, horrid teaching evaluations and things like that. And I ended up leaving that. And I actually taught high school for 4 years almost. And I actually loved it. I loved teaching high school students. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to, that was a kind of an intense jump from law school to high school. But I'm really glad that I did it because I feel like it helps me communicate complex things in a sort of quick, concise way. It's like with teenagers. I mean, my son, who's not a teenager anymore, he's like 23, but you talk to teenagers, you got to get in and out real quick, right? You can't just be like, oh, talk around, And, but then I kept getting fired because this is Utah. And after the third time I was fired for referring to the white administration at the high school I was teaching at, the white administration. Apparently they don't like being called that. So I was just like, I'm done. What am I going to do next? And my partner, she's like, yeah, let's, we've had it with white supremacy. Just, do something, like, let's figure out what you want to do next and let's focus on that, And so that's how this thing started. So that was what led to the Kickstarter thing that I started to talk about. And now I forgot what the original question. Oh, so yeah. So now this is my full-time job. I was a scholar in residence at the Schomburg last year working on this current project. I'm applying for a number of grants. Yeah, Simon & Schuster already has the option for this second book. And I'm doing a lot of paid lectures because I have this agent, and yeah, and like I was saying, talking to Ahmed before this thing officially started, a lot of the book talks and stuff have been virtual. I mean, I was in New York during the pandemic, but a lot of the book talks have been virtual because of the pandemic. But now I'm starting to travel. So I'm going to be in Charleston next week. And then I have I was invited to Norway for a literary festival, and they're like paying, they're actually paying me to be there, and paying all the all the expenses. And it's really funny, their email they sent to invite me, they're like, as pallid people, we know so little of this history. And I was like, pallid people? Like, is that a translation issue? Or do you really want to describe yourself like how we describe corpses? It's like, are you trying to say white people? I get it. Yeah, it's funny. So yeah, a lot of traveling and lecturing and working. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Holt. So we have another question in the chat, which actually opens up the question of Lloyd's. And I'm going to ask the question in the chat from Mario Torrao, but I am going to expand it a little bit because there was already a small conversation happening on the side. Mario asked that if we have any recourse when these private archives stop us, whether government should step in securing the release of historical information, especially with important issues like this. But I'm going to go ahead. Let's park this question because it's a great question about government's role or public institutions' roles in opening the doors of private institutions that may or hold relevant historical information. Let's park it there, but address also the sort of recent developments at Lloyd's, including the chat you had on HNet with the new archivist that they have. So can you give us a little bit of an update on how that conversation is going and what is happening with the new historian that they have, and then we can go back to this important question that affects us all about how to get access to these private institutions.
Right. So for those who have not read the book, let me just say one of the issues I was looking at the role of women on slave ship revolts, and drawing on the amazing work of the scholars who put together the transatlantic slave trade database, where they found that that there were revolts on 1 in 10 ships, which was shocking to, I think, most of us. I don't know, it was to me. And then that the only statistical difference between where there's a ship that had revolts and ships that didn't have revolt, like the main difference was that there were more women on the ships that had revolts. But these historians dismissed their own findings and said, well, that's counterintuitive because we know that women didn't participate in organized violent acts of revolt, which is the whole historiography issue, which, but anyway, so I wanted to look sort of quantitatively, and I went to London and I looked through a lot of slave trade captain's logs and whatnot, and there's a whole chapter in the book that uses my what I found of captain's logs and surgeon's logs that talk about women who led the revolts or initiated revolts. And I don't know if it's my legal background or I don't know, but my first question is like, what, why is this happening? And I looked at how the regulation of the slave trade, and spent a lot of time in the House of Lords Records office. That's it. Yeah. Looking at, and as we all know, this was a highly regulated business, and there was actually specific instruction about which captives were going to be kept where. And so, everyone was chained below deck until the ship left the coast of Africa to avoid cutoffs, and then women were brought on deck and left unchained. And, that's where the weapons were. And, they used that mobility. And so I wanted to get more information about this. And as folks may know, Lloyd's of London got its start basically in ensuring the slave trade. And they had a particular policy called Policy to Protect Against the Insurrection of Cargo, which is a chapter in the book. I wanted to get access to their records to see if I could get more sort of qualitative reportings of revolts. And I couldn't get anywhere near them, which is talked about in the book. But as Alex brought up, I thought, I'm going to take another go at this, because so the book actually came out in the UK, different press, the same day it came out here. And then so there's all this stuff happening in England around the book too. And people really zoned into the England, the UK parts. And they're like, what's this with Lloyd's? What do you mean? We're at a time of racial reckoning. How come they didn't, and I'm like, yeah, have you looked at their racial reckoning? It's just like, and then I'm like, well, maybe I was starting to get, like, I was interviewed by the BBC and the Guardian, and they were like, tell us a little bit. And I'm like, maybe now I can use this weird position I have to try to push a little bit at this. And I saw that they had hired an archivist, but it looked so sus to me. I was just like, oh, right, this is going to be one of those, But on HNet, she actually, responded to me directly. And she was great. Basically, I haven't gotten anywhere with that because I've been too busy dealing with a bunch of other stuff. But, she made herself available. And she also said that she thinks that the records I'm looking for are not really at Lloyd's anymore, that they're like distributed at different, did you say guild halls? I don't know. I need to look at it. But yeah, Alex, what were you going to say about the Lloyd's issue? Oh, the role of government.
Well, that was the original question by Mario was like, this is a question about not only you, but us. What do we feel like we should do when faced with this kind of things that you recount in the book, right? Like I kept putting myself in your shoes, and I was like, I was angry for you and for everybody who's ever been turned out at a private institution, because I have, and I think most people in the historical trade have at some point or another.
Right. Yeah, it's the British trade that I'm familiar with, and living in a common law country because of our, shared history. Really the only thing you could do would be to sue them somehow. And I'm not sure kind of what the legal theory would be. I know their big fear is, being open up to liability for reparations and also having their image tarnished. Maybe a government, you could sort of get the government, like, the federal government or something, or its equivalent in the UK, to say, hey, we want you to open these archives for this purpose. But whatever it is, it's going to take pressure. It's going to take, bottom up pressure. And I think that's ultimately how it works. Even if the government does finally get involved, it's because people have been pressing them. Yeah. And, a lot of people who aren't historians who read this book, they didn't even know what historians did. They didn't even know there were archives. They thought you just did stuff on Google. So now there are all these people who are invested in, like, oh, Dr. Hall, like, we have to get you into Lloyd's, or I can't believe how, the Queen's criminal court treated you, So yeah. I'm waiting for them to come out with like an action figure of like the historian, It'd be funny.
We're gonna use you as the leader of the of the guerrilla warfare we're about to unleash.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm here for it.
We have a question from Zoe Urabor. You want to come?
Yeah, I'll just speak. Very interesting presentation, Dr. Hall. I wanted to ask you about something that's a little bit off topic from what we're talking about right now. And that is a question about the politics of depicting Black women in history. Mm-hmm. So this may not be something that everyone is familiar with, but oftentimes in contemporary media where unknown Black women are depicted, there's a tendency to want to depict them maybe being lighter skinned or, having certain features. I wanted to know if pictures weren't available for these women, how did you and your associated graphic artist, how did you all decide who was going to look how?
Right. So what we did, and this might be kind of arbitrary, but it seemed reasonable to me, was we looked at the ethnicity of enslaved people in New York. And at that time period, it was a very large, dominant Akan enslaved population. So we looked at current pictures of women from Ghana. And used them as models. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the politics of representation, I mean, there's no way I would have, just had light-skinned European featured Black women. I mean, that, but the other thing that I was very in touch with and concerned about is this, this thing that Black feminists call pornotroping, right? Where you're portraying, the horrors of slavery and, all the things that, and so I put a lot of thought into, we're not going to put anything graphic or disturbing of, Black women being subjugated, unless it's absolutely necessary. And then when we do, we'll do it at a different angle. And so there's the story of the Negro Fiend. That's the only name I could get from her in the archival research, who led that revolt in 1708 in Queens. And she was burned at the stake. And so we're not going to show her being burned at the stake. So instead we showed her, the people being forced to look at her burning instead of her. So I think it's really important when you do this kind of work to not pornotrope, as, like Saidiya Hartman would say. Yeah.
I've never heard this term before, pornotrope. Would you mind spelling it so I could look it up elsewhere?
Okay. I'm thinking, wow, did I make that up? No, I read something, an article in, so what I'm referring to is Saidiya Hartman's book called Scenes of Subjection, where
Saidiya Hartman.
Yeah. And her name is spelled kind of strangely. It's like Saidiya. Yeah, it is spelled pornotrope.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's kind of like, I mean, something was going around on Twitter where people were really excited that the movie Sankofa was coming out and going to be available again. And, I just posted, hey folks, there's a lot of really brutal rape scenes filmed from the perspective of the rapist, and so, heads up before watching that. Yeah.
And what was the name of the book, if you don't mind to repeat it?
Yeah, it was her first book. It's called Scenes of Subjection.
Okay.
It's in the chat. We are putting it in the chat, then to not bother her to asking very specific quotes, then we will be doing that for Rebecca. Then you can just check the chat, please.
Oh,
thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
That's
but also
my
check out her latest book because it's awesome. It's just on fire.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. And if I can ask a follow-up question, because it's originally the question that I was gonna use for my prerogative as moderator, which is the choice of black and white for color, which follows on this question, I think, because obviously this is an expensive edition. It didn't need to be only black and white. If resources were the issue, I imagine that such a press can afford color. So I was wondering if this is just artist preference or if it was actually an intentional choice, because it does bring things to me in the reading, and I read it twice, in terms of the contrast. And it allows you to do absence and presence in the way that you so eloquently described, but it also cannot avoid this sort of clash between black and white, that is familiar to us in this very history. So I was wondering, what's the story behind the black and whiteness of it?
Yeah. So for me, I wanted to do that all along. It's similar to the aesthetic of wanting real pen and ink and not, digital art. But I wanted black and white because I feel that graphic narratives in black and white are more powerful. I think the color can be a distraction. I think there's a couple of exceptions. Like there's some amazing graphic narratives. Like it's this one, I can't remember her name, but she wrote, it's called The Best We Could Do. She was talking about being a refugee from Vietnam, and she does black and white with like splashes of orange. So like you can do like one color and it's not, but if you're doing like, you know, cartoon color, it's just, I think it takes away from the impact of the work. That's my personal feeling. But I hadn't thought through, Alex, what you were saying about in terms of it being uniquely suited to do this shape of absence. And now that you said that, and you think about like, could we have done that in color? And I'm like, yeah, that would have been hard. Yeah.
A little bit more difficult, but is it also, but this is the tricky part, is that it's also hard to avoid the racial connotations when you're reading it, because Black people and white people are characters in the story. So the color black and the color white then take on this added meaning, and I can see you putting intentionality into absence and presence, but there was no there in terms of your conversations with Hugo. You guys didn't talk about the colors in racial terms at any point.
No, we didn't. We did it, and I didn't really think about it. I mean, because yeah, I mean, black and white. I mean, it's also, it only makes sense because it's like tons of different shading, right? So this image of this woman, if she's Sarah or she's Abigail, we never find out, you know, reaching out to me in the archive, you know, like it doesn't matter what the color of my face is, right? I mean, I think it's more, you know, dress and hair texture and facial features. Yeah. And while I have the book open, I just wanted to say, like, in the spirit of not that this is not a dumbing down of the material, when I talk about the absence, I need to talk about the presence, like what is taking up all the space that they don't have any space, you know? And, you know, for me, it was like Dom Regina, and she's going to drive me nuts, you know, like, it's like every time you look at a court document, you know, every time they even mentioned the date, they had to do a paragraph with, you know, Dom Regina in it. And so, yeah, so anyway.
Thank you. And we have questions from moderators. First, Jessica, and then Anna.
Hello, Professor Hall. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is just it's amazing. I hope that you know how amazing it is. But just wanted to tell you how much I absolutely adore this work and the project in general of making all of the life. It's so important. I have a question that is loosely around, I think, genre. You know, like, this is obviously very much a history, but the way that you construct it with Hugo creates it as a history that is also really steeped in Black diasporic, but especially Black American culture. Like, I see there's references to Sweet Honey in the Rock. There's references to like mourning practices and ancestor work. Like, there are so many things here that crisscross, you know, beyond the like academic genre of history, but beyond sort of what we might think of traditional history. And of course, it also makes me think of Octavia Butler's Kindred, and the kind of work that Kindred does as far as time travel and moving the main character moving back and forth. So I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and talk about some of the ways that you are crossing genres, what genres inspired you, and
right,
and how that come together. Yeah, anything you want to say?
Yeah. I love Octavia Butler. I've read everything she's written. Kindred, that book is a nightmare. You know, it's like, it's a very different project than what I'm trying to do in Wake, because in Wake, I'm trying to tap into a usable past and how we can understand the impact of the past on our present and how that can help us get into the future. And Kindred was not about that. It was just like the nightmare horror story that we all have. Like, oh my God, what if I went to sleep and woke up and it was like slavery time? Like, it was just like a horror movie. So I think, you know, ironically, Afrofuturism was a big influence. I ended up needing to learn kind of more about it. when people were writing articles about the Kickstarter and they were saying, you know, new Afrofuturist book, I'm like, what? You know, so I and you know, and that, you know, a big part of that, there's this figure in the back, the last page of the book, where she's this is a Lele, but you know, rising up from the ocean, and she's saying for the future. And you see her kind of interspersed throughout in kind of, you know, subtle, hopefully not too subtle ways. And it's kind of like a narrative of this ancestry and progress, which the last chapter is called, Zap Mama song reference, that, you know, there's a direction that we're traveling in. You know, this isn't one of those teleological, like, you know, the arc of the universe bends towards, none of that, but just that, you know, the history of resistance has a past, a present, and a future. And we Black people need to make sure that we see ourselves in the future. So that kind of temporal relationship, that relationship with temporality, having it be sort of almost more circular rather than a kind of a straight line, I think is really influenced by a kind of Afrofuturist approach.
Thank you. I love it.
Thank you. Anna?
Okay, let me see if I can go. Then first of all, of course, congratulations, Rebecca. I was one of the big early supporters of this project. And
Yes, you were.
When I saw the book, then before that I wrote the blurb of the book, and of course I was not expecting that the book would have so much. First of all, we know that you could talk a little bit about your research in terms of the role of enslaved women in resistance in this early period that you examine, and the kind of obstacles that you faced when doing research that was academic research on this topic. And of course, that the academic work, we need your academic work, and we need the academic work of other Black women historians who are doing similar work. I think here about Karen Cook Bell, also by my colleague Nick Taylor, who is also working on similar on similar topics. But then when you decide to convey this story through this graphic narrative, that I love this term, there are so many other dimensions that show up. First, then of course, this is then British North America, then it becomes United States. You cover New York City. The entire work that you did has this connection with the city itself. Then all these people that you were talking about today, they are memorialized, for example, in the African burial ground and so on. And the connections here with the present that you do is really, I think it's really important, because it's you as a Black woman, is you as a historian who is finding these gaps. And as someone already perhaps mentioned, some of these obstacles that you found in the archives, perhaps if it was another historian, perhaps things would be perhaps easier. Mm-hmm. And I think that you were able really to highlight that it's not only about on how complicated it is writing these histories. When there is the archive itself, then you have these representations in your book of the people, when you enter the archives, that they check your bag and you need authorizations that you didn't get, and all these things. And later on also, then not only then the issue of racism in the archive and in the sources that you are looking at. But then when you go to Britain as well, I love what you did, because once again, we have this connection with the present, of course, with all the debate about Lloyd's and the issue of reparations. But you visit, in a few pages, you are able to highlight very important dimensions that are part of the current debate now, including, for example, a visit to the British Museum that is not only about then slavery, but is also about colonialism. And we have then this amazing sequence in which you have then these artworks and the image of the British Museum. Then, in my opinion, it's really a very rich book that, because of this visual dimension, is going to be, then you need time to extract from here all that the book has to offer. But as I said before we started, one of the elements that really I loved about the book is the way that you show how complicated, it's almost a lesson on how to work with primary sources. Then we can give grades to our students, we can do primary source analysis, but what you do here is really an important lesson. And finally, one of the elements that I think that you could hardly do in academic work, it is there were elements here in this book that, of course, there is the tragedy, the pain, but there were moments that we can laugh because there is humor also. There is a sort of narrative that you reflect about what you were doing, and sometimes you want to laugh because it's then the problems, they keep coming back and you are responding to it, and also giving a lot of there are levels here that you give explanations that are based really that you can recognize the academic work that is behind that. Then, in my opinion, it's really impressive that we can accomplish that much with this kind of work. And I think that it just shows that if you want to reach larger audiences in periods that students are being taught all kinds of bullshit in school, at the school level, what you do here is really a major accomplishment. And I hope that that a lot of people will read the book. Then, as you can see, this was not a question, it was typical academic. This is more of a comment than a question. But I want to emphasize that for all of you who didn't read the book yet, then I really advise you to do, and I advise you also to consider then that to encourage your students to do so as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. I'm honored. Thank you.
Did you want to respond, or that?
I'm mainly blushing, but yeah. I mean, I really hope that more academics get their information out in ways like this. You know, like to try to break down that wall. You know, because our work is not merely academic, right? It's very important for understanding our present. And yeah, and if people want to, you know, contact me or whatever, just hit me up on @Wake Revolt on Twitter, and I respond to everyone who, so far I've been able to anyway, respond to everyone who direct messages me. So yeah. Well, thank you for having me be part of this book club. It's really awesome.
We're not done yet, unless you.
No, okay.
Unless you have to rush.
How much time do we have?
We usually go until we usually do 1 hour and a half. So we usually
good,
go
good.
until 6:30.
Okay, I have so much more to say. I for some reason I thought it was an hour, and I thought that Anna was doing that, like sum up
the closing praise.
The closing, yeah.
She does do that. She does do that.
But you don't. But now you don't have to. You already. Yeah. When you were talking about the UK, I'm trying to find that. Okay. Yeah. So we spent a lot of time thinking this through, because, like, I've spent quite a lot of time in the UK for research purposes, and there's this weird thing, and like where I wanted to try to, and again, like I don't know how to do this in other medium, but you know, like where I talk about how the British are so into their tea and sugar, right? I mean, they're all about it, right? And they're completely divorced from the history of their tea and their sugar. And so, like, you know, Hugo and I spent hours trying to figure this panel out with where we were going to show that history on the actual teapot, you know, and so, you know, and yes, the scene in the British Museum, which, I mean, that's something I feel like people are perhaps more familiar with. I mean, anyway, with the movie Black Panther, I think that, you know, they talk about it. But yeah, and I think also, you know, one of the things that I didn't do in the graphic novel because I didn't want to bore people, and I haven't figured out a way to do it kind of explicitly, but is to deal with the historiography of the topic itself of women in revolt. I don't like the term rebellion. I don't use it personally because I don't know. I've read too much John Locke. It's, you know, there's this thing about like who exists outside the realm of the political, like that, you know, and like, you know, teenagers rebel. You know, people who have no, you know, they're just foreclosed from the realm of the political. So I don't like to use the term rebellion, but I think I'm one of the few people, and I can't argue with everybody. So, but you know, the kind of underlying issue that got me involved in this research in the first place was I was really interested in looking at the early legal creations of slavery and the role that gender played in that. And doing that research, you know, I really found that I couldn't research slavery and not research slave resistance because it wasn't good for my mental health. So I started focusing on revolt, and you know, and then just kept, you know, getting book after book after book that just, you know, said like women didn't do this. We all know women didn't do this. And it's like, why are all these books saying this and saying it in the first like 30 pages? Like I could, and you know, like what's the investment? Like what's going on? And then when I, you know, went to New York and I looked at the legal documents there, I mean, there were women in the sources. So, you know, the dissertation and then the article that I wrote called Not Killing Me Softly, I can't even remember the subtitle, but, you know, looks at what the investments are, you know, in the historiography, and why the history of revolt was written that way. And at the time in 2003 or whatever, when I was finishing my dissertation, it was still like considered, you know, really like, what are you saying? Women really did that, you know? And I don't know. And I still, like, I've talked to a couple of historians who I really respect more recently in the last 4 or 5 years, and they were still sort of like, really? You know, and then I feel like in a way, this book kind of almost jumped over that historiography wall. And it's like, and here, and like, no, it's like people outside of the profession are like, what? Of course women did this. Women do everything, you know? So it's like, oh, okay, I don't have to do that anymore. You know, I don't have to have this conversation anymore. Yeah. But, oh, thanks for linking that. Yeah.
Question real quick. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go.
While we wait for the audience to ask their own questions, taking advantage of this bounty of having you for an extra 30 minutes. And then, but I did have another question about this sort of like meta narrative, because I found this such an effective mechanism or method or to tell this history. Way like the history didn't lose. I didn't feel there was anything lossiness to the historical narrative in casting it as the researchers encounter with the archive. I thought that actually that was even more effective because it was like, you know, that Bertolt Brecht used to say that he wanted his actors to smoke on stage to remind people that it was that these are real people who are actors who have jobs, and it's not this illusion. So I feel, of course, sometimes history becomes this illusion that hides the archive. That's like some people are surprised that there are even archives, right? Like, don't you just Google? But the fact of bringing that work to life, you did such a great job with that, and I think it's even a labor issue, right? That you bring that labor to light, you make it visible where it remains invisible in the profession in many ways. And I was wondering if you wanted to say a little bit more about what your own thoughts about the importance of the meta-narrative as a methodology are.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny how it came about, because when I originally conceptualized the story, I was just going to tell the story of women and their involvement in revolt. But then I realized, like, wait, I need to put myself in there in order to narrate the stories. And then it's like, oh, now I'm in it. Like, let me speak my truth. I mean, why write if you're not going to write stuff that's hard and that's not the truth, you know? And so then that became very much the story of how hard it was for me to do this research. And that wasn't the direction I was expecting it to go to begin with. But yeah, I feel like, you know, especially, you know, since the book came out and seeing so many, you know, non-academics really get excited about history and historians and what we do, I think it's awesome. And for me, it's always been like historiography, history, that they've always been equally interesting to me. And the process of how do we, you know, there are, you know, these dusty shelves and whatever, you know, there are bodies in there, you know, laying on those shelves. And, you know, how do we get them out? And how do we, you know, tell their stories? It's very compelling to me. And yeah, and the other thing, which we didn't bring up, but now that we have time, I wanted to bring up, there's like a chapter and a half in there which I thought, Alex, that you were going to talk about first, but where I call it a measured use of historical imagination. So where I specifically say, okay, so the records have just fallen silent. What could we imagine happened in this instance? And I do it for the 4 women in the 1712 revolt. And then I do for like half a chapter. And then later on, imagine which women could have gotten caught up in this slave ship, the Unity, where there were 4 revolts, like led by women and documented in the captain's log. But I felt deeply uncomfortable doing that because I'm a historian, you know, and it's like, I'm not a fiction writer. I don't, you know, I mean, this is the first, I mean, but I think that what I committed to do was to make everything about those sections as historically accurate as possible. It was not like, you know, like, for example, there's a discussion of like an oathing ceremony that happens before the 1712 revolt. And we know that it happens because the colonial governor at the time, reporting to the Lords of Trade, describes that there was an oath. And then I was like, okay, so what was that like? And what would it look like? You know, and back to the visual thing. And so again, heavy Akan presence, where it was another Akan presence in the same time period, Jamaica. So let me look at Taki's revolt. So then there's actual detailed descriptions of what these oathing ceremonies looked like and what was involved. Okay, you know, cemetery, dirt, you know, alcohol, what, and so like taking the more detailed descriptions that occurred for that revolt, because, and the purpose of that archive, that kind of document was to say, if you see this, watch out, because this is showing danger. So I took that stuff and used it and drew on it to create the oathing ceremony, you know, in the book. So there's no part of any of those, you know, the measured use of historical imagination, which apparently I learned at the Schomburg. I was surrounded by a lot of Black studies professors, and that's not something I've not really been around. And they talk about critical fabulation, which is a term I'd never heard of, but where you have to try to fill in some of the gaps, but you got to be really specific and let people know, look, I am filling in a gap here, so we could try to make some kind of sense of this narrative, but it's me filling it in, but trust my integrity. I am being very careful when I do that. Yeah. And I was expecting more pushback about that, and it actually, I really haven't gotten any.
That's a whole nother subject of conversation. It's huge. The critical fabulation that I'm surprised that you hadn't heard it earlier in the process, since it's such an important part of the conversation today. The role of that speculatio is going to have in our methods. Yeah, because the boundaries are not clear. What counts as speculation and what is not. When we're reading into a silence can be just as empirical as reading into a presence, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Did anybody? Do we have any questions from the audience? I don't want this to be a conversation between Dr. Hall and me. We are offering this opportunity for you to engage with Dr. Hall. We have a question from Cynthia. Yes, please, Cynthia.
Me again. I have a question about how did you know when to stop? Because you're talking about your discoveries, and sounds like there's some pivot points for you that you started at one place and then you ended up going in a different direction because of some information that you found. And I think one of the biggest problems I personally have is once I find one piece of information, then I go down a rabbit hole of that. And I was wondering how you determined with this particular project, at what point did you just say, okay, I've got sufficient information to do this project or to complete this project?
The project being the graphic narrative or the underlying
Exactly.
research?
The dissertation, I know there's probably a time frame. You got to get it done, right? But I'm figuring for the graphic novel piece that you probably could have gone on forever based on things that you found. I was just interested in if you have your own trigger point. That's like, this is for me. It's, for example, it's when I see the same information more than once, then I figure, okay, I've covered all my bases. But what was the thing that brought you to that point?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I'm not quite sure how to answer it. So writing a script for a graphic narrative is a whole thing that I had to learn to do. And it was probably the most intensely creative writing thing that I've ever done. I found out, I needed silence. I needed to be like away from home to write, I had to be like, it turned out I had all these like diva needs that I didn't even know about, like I need food delivered, I'm writing, but I think that the graphic novel story, the script, was its own being, and it felt clear to me when something was done, and I wanted it to be, I didn't want it to be more than a couple hundred pages because I wanted people to be able to read it. So it wasn't a struggle for me. The struggle that you're describing seems more like the underlying research struggle. And for me, when I did that, I just went as far as I could, and would only give up after, getting kicked out of an archive or, or like not clear after looking through 10 years of correspondence between the governor and the lords of trade, like whether it was Sarah or Abigail that was, executed. There's just no answer. Like you just have to, at some point, you just have to be like, okay, there's no answer. I've looked everywhere, and yeah. And you can
Thanks.
see also documentation that's like messed up, that's mistaken, you know, like in the book that these two women, Sarah and Abigail, who are convicted and sent to be executed, but one of them is pregnant, and so her execution is suspended because of that. But we never find out who that was. And I looked through everything, like, you know, documents about executions that were created at the time. I could not find, you know, and stuff that even early, like historians in the 19th century put together, because a lot of the documents in colonial New York were destroyed in a couple of different fires. So, you know, the work of like later historians that they had drawn, and then they got stuff wrong, you know, where they're like, oh, it was this person. And it's like, you don't know that, you know? So yeah, you know, the dead ends that we all run into.
Thanks.
Indeed. So one of the things we do, of course, is if the audience is being shy about a question, we just organically come to an end. So it's not like we force ourselves to. I do want to say this is the largest audience we've had since last year. This is a testament to the wonderful work that you did here. Again, it makes me want to go back into the classroom just so that I can assign it.
Go ahead, do it.
Yeah, no. Wait until the pandemic is over. It's optional to me. I don't have to.
I want people to teach. Some people I know are teaching the graphic novel with the academic article, and they've been saying it's been really, really fruitful. So if I were teaching, if I were allowed in a classroom, apparently I'm not allowed in one, I would do that, because I think that would be an interesting thing for history students, graduate students too. Yeah,
I think so, and not only in history departments. I think one of the things that makes this book great is that it can actually serve as an introduction to the subject to students in other fields and even people who are not at the university. When I announced that this was happening on my Facebook, I have a bunch of graphic narratives, as we're calling them. I love the term. People on my Facebook feed. It's just part of my world. That's just the geeks that love like me since we were kids, and we're all Gen Xers now, and we love that stuff. And and a bunch of them are like, I never heard of this one, and I'm like, yeah, I get it. And I think that there was another graphic novel that actually came up on the feed. I wish I had written it down. That was based on resistance in Ghana. I think if it was a graphic novel, I was in Ghana or.
Oh, you mean Abina and the famous.
Yeah. Which I haven't read yet.
Trevor Getz. Yeah.
Yes,
it's not really. Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, we're in contact. He's great. Yeah, he got me hired by the.
Check that one out. Where do you see your work in the history of the graphic novel itself? Because that's interesting that all these comic book people came out of the woodworks. Of course, Karen Green, who is the librarian of graphic novels and comic books, etc. here at Columbia, has built one of the largest collections ever. That's part of my world too. It's my colleague at the library here at Columbia, and it's. In this world, the book also plays a role, right? What role? Yeah.
That's intense. I mean, that's another, like, I'm backing into this. I don't know what I'm doing. And then it's like, wow. So the reviews that came out, I was expecting, there'd be good reviews and bad reviews and reviews, like any book, right? But the reviews were consistently like stellar, so there are these trade publications, which I didn't really know what they were, like Publishers Weekly and Kirkus and whatever. And all four of them gave it a star review, which was apparently not something that happens. But anyway, there was a review by the NPR where they said, this book now sets the standard for illustrating history. Like, if you're going to try to do this, you need to meet this standard that, and that was just, that really took me back. And it's like, and, I've been on panels, like I was on a Comic-Con panel with, other comic artists. And it's strange having to talk in all these different kind of venues. And, but and I've had people say like, come and talk to our visual artists class about, I was like, what? No, that's not appropriate. It's like, have you thought about teaching visual arts? It's like, are you kidding me? I can't even draw a stick figure, like, so I don't know, we'll see. But, in terms of, how it's been written about is, people are taking the book very seriously. So, we'll see how that all plays out in terms of its impact in the historiography of comics, whatever that is,
Traditionally, we end with asking our authors about their future work, but we already covered your future work today. If you wanted to say a little bit more of what's next for Dr. Rebecca Hall, this is a good time.
Okay.
Let's leave like at least 3 or 4 minutes for Ana Lucia to introduce our next book club, which is happening soon. So please tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So I really feel like the history around Reconstruction is really important in terms of understanding where we are at all. And I think that I've been really drawn to, and I have published in like a law textbook and some stuff on Reconstruction, but I've been really drawn to sort of the more militant types of freedom taking or freedom claims that enslaved women and later freed women were involved in. So there's like a whole section on like, drawing like heavily on the research of other historians like Leslie Schwalm and Fabiola Glimpf and about women like killing all the livestock on a plantation and having a feast, and I've been just reading, like I spent all year reading, they're mainly letters written by women slavers complaining to whoever, their sister, their their husband, I call them my slave owning Karens, but they're like, oh, I can't believe, she disrespected me in this way. I asked her to answer the bell and she said she's not doing that anymore. And, or one, like I found this document, when I was at the Schomburg, of these enslaved people actually built a, what do you call that? A gallows in front of the big house, and was like, and anytime the mistress asked them to work, they would just point at the gallows. She was like, okay, I'm not asking for. I think these stories are really important for people to, to recover these stories. I also feel a little bit like I'm out of my element because I do 18th century Northern urban, and suddenly I'm in the part of slavery that I never was interested in writing about, because most people in their minds, they think of slavery, they think of like Southern, rural, Gone with the Wind, whatever, a movie which I never saw and still will never see. But it's exciting. And so it's looking at different, freedom claims, through the Civil War and then, through the Reconstruction period. And right now I'm writing a lot of grants to try to keep working on it. So
we're all rooting for you and looking forward
to
your next work. I'm definitely pre-ordering as soon as it's out. Thank you so much, everybody. Let's show in our different emojis and with our words how grateful we are to have Dr. Rebecca Hall here. And I will pass on the mic and the camera now to Ana Lucia, who's going to introduce our next book club. Thank you, Rebecca.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. And
thank you so much, Rebecca. You are going to then just to invite you to the next book club. Let me see if you can see this here. Then you are going to have Tamika Nunley at the Threshold of Liberty, Women, Slavery, and Shifting Identities in Washington, D.C. This is a book published by University of North Carolina Press in 2021. And Tamika, she teaches as an associate professor at Cornell University. And we will be, again, as we have been doing a lot during this second semester, looking at history of Black women, this time here in Washington, D.C. Then you are all invited. This is November 17 at 5 p.m. Wednesday, and you can go to www.slaveryarchive.wordpress.com in order to register to attend on Zoom, or later you can go to YouTube. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much, Rebecca, for this beautiful book
I'm actually
and
reading
nice
that
presentation.
Book. The book you described, I'm actually reading it at the moment.
Yeah. Oh, great! Then you are welcome to attend if you have energy.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.